I grew my dad's company to $85 million. Then one night at dinner he looked at me, smiled, and said, "Your brother will take over now. Stay with me while I share what really happened. And if this story moves you, I'd love it if you could support us by subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing it with others who might connect with." My name is Stella, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived and breathed my father's company. It wasn't just a job, it was my entire life. I was the kid who sat in the office after school, filing papers and listening to my dad's business calls while other kids were outside playing. I grew up believing that one day, if I worked hard enough, he would look at me and see not just his daughter, but his partner, his successor. For years, I sacrificed everything that could have made me feel young and carefree. I gave up weekends, skipped vacations, and stayed in the office long after the lights should have gone out. When my friends in college were going to parties, I was flying out to meet potential clients. When they were dating and figuring out their lives, I was building a business that had once been on the verge of collapse. I thought my dad saw that. I thought he was proud of me. So when he called for a family dinner at his favorite restaurant, I thought this was it. The night he'd finally acknowledge me, the night he'd make it official. I dressed carefully, my hands shaking as I zipped up my dress. In my heart, I imagined him raising a glass and saying, "Stella, you've done it. The company is yours to lead." The dinner started like any other. My dad laughed. Robert cracked jokes that weren't really funny, and I smiled through my nerves. Plates clattered, waiters passed, and the scent of grilled steak filled the air. My father looked at me a few times during the meal, his eyes soft, almost proud. I felt certain. My chest buzzed with anticipation. But then, with that same smile I had been waiting for my whole life, he turned toward Robert. "Son," he said warmly, "it's time. You're going to take over the company." The words crashed down like a thunderstorm I couldn't escape. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I blinked, waiting for him to laugh, to correct himself, to say he was joking. But he didn't. He kept smiling, as if he'd just announced the most natural thing in the world. I stared at my plate, my fork frozen in my hand. Robert grinned wide, puffing out his chest like he had earned it, like he had been the one in the office every day for the last 10 years. My mother reached over to pat his hand, her eyes glowing with approval. The rest of the table clapped lightly, nodding along as if this was right, as if this was normal. But it wasn't normal. It wasn't right. My entire life had been poured into that company, every fiber of my being stretched to hold it together, to grow it into something incredible. And in a single sentence, my father erased all of that. I felt the sting in my eyes, the tears that threatened to spill, but I swallowed them back. I forced myself to sit still, to keep my face calm while inside I was breaking. No one spoke for me. No one looked my way. It was as though I wasn't even there. In that silence, I realized something. I had been invisible all along. When I think back to my childhood, it feels like my entire life was shaped around my father's company. While other kids played outside, I was in the office, carrying folders that were almost bigger than me. I'd sit quietly in the corner of his meetings, watching him speak with clients, memorizing every detail. He would pat my head sometimes and say, "That's my girl, always paying attention." Those words meant everything to me. They made me believe I was special, that he saw something in me no one else did. Robert, on the other hand, was never interested. He was the son who got away with anything. If he didn't feel like helping, he wouldn't. If he messed up at school, my parents brushed it aside. They said he was just finding himself. But when I brought home a grade that was less than perfect, my father's face would harden, and he'd remind me that the family name depended on me. Even then, it was clear, we weren't held to the same standard. As I grew older, my role in the company grew too. At 15, I was already answering calls and setting up schedules for my father. By 17, I was running errands to secure small deals. I remember one evening, my friends begged me to join them for the school dance. I had already bought a dress, but that night a client called with a problem. My father didn't even ask. He just looked at me and said, "Handle it." I slipped out of the dress, put on my work clothes, and did exactly what he wanted. That became the pattern of my life. Trade joy for responsibility, laughter for silence, freedom for duty. College wasn't any different. While other students stayed up late cramming for exams, I was on flights, following my dad into conference rooms where the air smelled of coffee and stress. I missed parties, I missed birthdays, I missed chances at love. A boy I cared for once told me, "You're married to your dad's company." I laughed it off, but inside I knew he was right. The company was my life partner, the only thing I ever truly gave myself to. Robert, though, lived like nothing mattered. He partied, drank, wrecked cars, and each time my parents covered for him. I can still see my mother's worried face when she begged my father not to let Robert face any real consequence. And my father always would sigh and say, "He's just young. He'll grow out of it." Meanwhile, I wasn't allowed to make a single mistake. Every misstep I took was a lesson drilled into me until I was perfect. Sometimes, when I closed a deal or fixed a crisis, I thought I saw pride in my father's eyes. A flicker, small but real. Once, after I negotiated a contract that saved the company thousands, he told me, "You have a sharp mind, Stella. Sharper than most men." I carried those words in my heart, believing they meant I was the heir he secretly wanted, even if he never said it out loud. But as I look back now, I see the truth more clearly. I wasn't being trained to lead. I was being used to build. My sacrifices were convenient for him. My loyalty was his greatest tool, and my dreams never mattered. I thought I was the chosen one, but in reality, I was just the worker who made the empire strong enough to hand to Robert. And that realization hurts more than anything. When I stepped fully into the company after college, it wasn't the empire people know today. Back then, it was barely staying afloat, surviving paycheck to paycheck with contracts that could vanish overnight. Our revenue sat at around $2 million, and most of that came from small clients who weren't sure if they could trust us long-term. My father was proud of the family name, but behind closed doors, I could see the cracks forming. Vendors were pulling out, employees whispered about job security, and every month felt like it could be our last. I threw myself into the work like my life depended on it. I stopped thinking of hours as something to measure. My days and nights blended together. There were weeks when I barely saw my own apartment. I slept on the office couch, fueled by cold coffee and the sound of my laptop humming. Every lead mattered. Every client call was a battle, and I fought with everything I had. Slowly, deal by deal, the company started to grow. I remember the first major contract I secured. It was with a client who had already turned us down twice. My father had given up. Robert hadn't even tried, but I couldn't let it go. I studied their needs, spent nights rewriting proposals, and showed up at their office uninvited until they gave me a chance. That deal doubled our revenue in less than a year. I should have felt joy, but all I felt was exhaustion. I went home, collapsed on my bed, and cried. Not because I was sad, but because the weight of carrying everyone on my back finally broke me free. That was only the beginning. I spearheaded expansions into new markets, convinced investors to trust us, and built relationships that turned small opportunities into long-term contracts. Each time a door slammed in my face, I found another door to knock on. Each time someone underestimated me, I worked harder until they had no choice but to respect me. By the time we hit $50 million in revenue, people in the industry knew my name more than my father's. Yet, in public, I stayed quiet and let him take the credit. Robert, meanwhile, was a ghost in the office. He came in late, left early, and whenever he was there, he created more problems than solutions. He pitched ideas that made no sense, wasted money on flashy projects, and spent company funds on dinners and trips that had nothing to do with business. I can still see him walking into meetings hungover, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. And the worst part, everyone at the company knew he wasn't contributing. They whispered about how Stella ran everything, how Robert was just a figurehead. They knew the truth, but my father refused to acknowledge it. Whenever there was a company event, he'd stand on stage, clap Robert on the back, and say, "This is the future of our business." My name was rarely mentioned. I was the one pulling in millions, but Robert was the one being celebrated. I stood in the crowd, smiling tightly, clapping like everyone else, even as something inside me cracked a little more each time. By the time the company reached $85 million in revenue, I had nothing left to give. I was exhausted to my bones, lonely from years of living only for work, and tired of pretending I didn't want the recognition I deserved. I had carried the company from near collapse to greatness, but in my father's eyes, I was still invisible. And Robert, the brother who did nothing, stood in the spotlight that was rightfully. After that dinner, my body felt numb. The words kept echoing in my head. My father smiling as he told Robert he would take over the company, as if all my years of sacrifice had been nothing more than a favor I was supposed to do. I barely tasted the food, barely heard the laughter that carried on around the table, as if nothing had happened. When the plates were cleared and everyone was saying their goodbyes, I pulled my father aside. My hands were shaking, but I needed answers. "Dad," I said, my voice breaking before I could steady it. "How could you do that? After everything I've done, everything I gave up. How could you just hand the company to Robert?" He looked at me, not with anger, not even with guilt, but with that same detached calmness he always had when he thought he was teaching me a lesson. He sighed, as though my pain was just a childish outburst. "You'll understand one day," he said, his tone almost patronizing. "A company like ours should be led by a man in this family. That's the way it's supposed to be." Those words cut deeper than any rejection ever had. In one sentence, he had erased not just my work, but my identity. Everything I had sacrificed, the years, the relationships, the joy I had traded for late nights and endless meetings, none of it mattered. I wasn't being denied because I wasn't capable. I was being denied because I wasn't born his son. I felt my chest tighten, the air leaving my lungs as if I had been punched. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he was wrong, that the company wouldn't even exist without me. But I couldn't. I stood frozen, my eyes stinging, while he simply placed a hand on my shoulder like he was comforting a child who didn't get their way. Then he walked off, leaving me standing there with my heart in pieces. When I stepped out of the room, Robert was waiting. He leaned against the wall, a smug smile stretched across his face. "Rough talk with Dad?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't worry, sis. You can still work for me. I'll need someone to handle the boring stuff. You're good at that." The way he said it made my stomach churn. He wasn't just gloating. He genuinely believed it. He thought I existed to serve him, that all my years of carrying the company were nothing more than practice for becoming his assistant. The arrogance in his eyes made me want to slap him, but I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my chest burning with a mix of grief and fury. I replayed every moment of my life where I had chosen the company over myself. Every night I stayed late, every client I fought for, every sacrifice I made. And for what? To be told my worth ended at my gender, to be mocked by a brother who had never lifted a finger? As the hours passed, my tears dried, replaced by something sharper. Rage, yes, but also clarity. I knew then that staying silent, hoping my father would someday see me, was no longer an option. If they wanted to cast me aside, if they thought they could erase me, they were wrong. I made a vow to myself in the dark of that night. I would not stay quiet. I would not accept being invisible. They thought they had broken me, but all they had done was light a fire I would never let die. I tried to keep going after that dinner. I told myself maybe it was just words. Maybe my father would see sense once Robert actually had to take responsibility. I convinced myself that if I kept working, if I kept proving myself, he couldn't ignore me forever. So I went back into the office, sat at my desk, and pushed forward like I always had. But it didn't take long for me to realize things had changed. Robert started showing up with an arrogance he had never had before. He strutted through the halls like he owned the place, interrupting meetings and signing off on decisions he didn't even understand. Deals I had spent weeks negotiating, he would tear up in a matter of minutes. "Too cautious," he'd say, waving off my strategies as if they were scraps of paper. He threw money at projects that had no future, invested in clients who were clearly unstable, and ignored the relationships I had spent years carefully building. I watched in silence as he wasted what I had worked so hard to protect. It wasn't just bad decisions, it was deliberate. He started overriding me in front of staff, mocking my input in casual conversations, dismissing me with a smirk. "Relax, Stella," he'd say whenever I pointed out his mistakes. "Not everything has to be perfect." But I knew it wasn't about perfection. It was about survival. And Robert didn't care if he burned the company down, because he believed Dad would always bail him out. The worst moment came during a board meeting. I had prepared a detailed presentation on our next expansion. Numbers, projections, risks, everything outlined clearly. I stood up, nerves steady, ready to show the board why this move would keep us on top. Halfway through, Robert cut me off. He leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "This is why women can't run companies. You're too emotional, Stella. You're overthinking everything. Business needs guts, not fear." The room went silent. I felt every eye on me, and for a second I couldn't breathe. My face burned, my hands trembled, but I forced myself to keep standing, to swallow the humiliation pressing against my throat. A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, some looking at me with pity, others lowering their gaze. No one defended me, not even my father. In that moment, it became clear. This wasn't about strategy, it wasn't about leadership. It was about erasing me. My years of sacrifice, my loyalty, my blood poured into this company. It was all being pushed aside so Robert could play king in a throne I had built. I wasn't just being overlooked anymore. I was being erased from my own legacy. That night, I went home and sat in the dark, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed her father would someday look at her with pride. I thought about the woman I had become, the one who gave up everything, love, friends, time, for a dream that was never mine to keep. And then I thought about Robert's smirk, my father's silence, and the way the board had let me stand there humiliated. The tears that slid down my face weren't just from pain anymore. They were from resolve. If they wanted betrayal, I would give them betrayal. If they thought they could strip me of everything I had built, they were wrong. They had underestimated me for the last time. Stella had always been a strategist, not just in business, but in life. The same meticulous attention she gave to scaling her father's company into an $85 million empire was now being redirected into something darker: survival. Revenge. If they wanted her gone, she wasn't going quietly. Every evening, after the long, humiliating hours at the office, she returned to her apartment, opened her laptop, and began the quiet work of dismantling the narrative her father and Robert had crafted. It started with emails. Stella had an impeccable memory, and she knew exactly which threads to pull. A client complaint Robert had buried in his inbox, contracts he'd mishandled, receipts of reckless spending. All of it became carefully labeled digital folder. She wasn't just collecting proof, she was building a weapon. One night, sipping black coffee at 2 a.m., she stared at her screen and whispered to herself, "If they erase me, I'll erase them first." Her allies came slowly but surely. A quiet lunch here, a hushed meeting in a corner office there. People who had worked with Stella for years remembered her brilliant. They had seen firsthand how she rescued deals Robert nearly destroyed. When she extended a hand, they didn't just take it, they leaned in. One by one, they began slipping her information, little details that could tip the scales. "Check the numbers from the Raleigh deal," one whispered. Another sent over screenshots of Robert's sloppy handling of vendor contract. The pieces were falling into place, and Stella was the only one who knew how to put the puzzle together. But Stella wasn't reckless. She knew betrayal this large needed to be airtight. So she met quietly with lawyers, the kind who understood not only corporate law, but also the labyrinth her father had built around the company. They dissected her father's will, his trusts, and every line of the contracts that bound her stake in the business. And there it was, the smallest of loopholes, a clause hidden in dense legal jargon that, with the right evidence and timing, could give her leverage not just against Robert, but against David himself. It wasn't much. It was fragile, almost invisible. But to Stella, it was enough. She left those meetings with a new kind of confidence burning in her chest. If her father thought he had locked her out completely, he underestimated. If Robert thought he could ride her work into the ground while wearing the crown of successor, he had no idea the noose she was weaving behind the scenes. Her days became a balancing act, outwardly calm, inwardly ruthless. She let Robert have his moments, let him bark orders and mismanage funds while she stood in silence. No one could see the storm she was preparing. She had become a ghost in her own company, present but invisible, listening more than speaking, watching every slip he made. And Robert, arrogant as ever, kept handing her ammunition. Late one evening, Stella stared at her growing mountain of proof, documents, testimonies, contracts highlighted with neon markers. It was enough to crush him, maybe even her father. She closed her laptop, leaned back, and allowed herself the faintest smile. They thought betrayal was a one-way street. They thought they could strip her of everything she had built. But Stella knew something they didn't. Betrayal was a game she could play too, and she intended to win. Robert's downfall started with the deal he thought would make him look like a genius. He had been bragging for weeks about a new partnership he was pursuing, talking about it to the board as if it were already secured. I knew from the start it was a disaster. The numbers didn't add up. The partners he was chasing had a reputation for shady practices, and every instinct in me screamed that it would bleed the company dry. I tried to warn him, even pulled him aside one afternoon and laid out every risk in detail. He waved me off with that arrogant grin of his. "Don't worry, Stella. I've got this. Not everything has to be done your way." 2 weeks later, the nightmare came true. The contract Robert had rushed to sign was about to cost the company millions in penalties and losses. Investors were furious, clients were threatening to pull out, and the phones in the office rang nonstop with people demanding answers. Robert, of course, was nowhere to be found. He shut himself in his office, leaving me to face the storm. I spent 72 hours barely sleeping, combing through every clause of the deal, negotiating with lawyers, and begging the partners to reconsider terms. By the grace of persistence and a little luck, I managed to untangle the worst parts of the contract and save the company from falling into a financial pit it might never have climbed out of. When the final papers were signed and the bleeding was stopped, I sat at my desk, trembling from exhaustion. I had saved them again. But when the board gathered to discuss the crisis, my father stood at the head of the table and said, "Robert showed great courage taking this risk. Mistakes happen, but it's part of learning how to lead." My stomach dropped. I had done everything. I had carried the weight, fixed the disaster, shielded the company from ruin. And yet, in front of everyone, my father praised Robert as though he had been the hero. Robert sat there, smirking, leaning back in his chair like a king. That was the moment something in me snapped. I had spent months collecting proof of Robert's incompetence, quietly gathering emails, financial records, and complaints from clients who had grown tired of his careless attitude. I hadn't been sure when or if I would use it. But now, as I looked around the boardroom and saw the lies being dressed up as truth, I knew the time had come. I stood up, my voice steady though my heart was racing. "That's not what happened," I said. The room turned toward me. Robert laughed nervously, but I didn't flinch. I laid out everything. Emails showing Robert had ignored warnings, financial records proving how much money he had wasted, testimonies from clients he had driven away. One by one, I placed the evidence in front of the board until the room was heavy with silence. Robert's face went pale, his smirk gone. The board members exchanged uneasy looks, whispering to one another. One finally spoke. This is serious. If what Stella says is true, Robert has been endangering this company. The tide shifted quickly. People who had once nodded along to Robert's careless ideas were now questioning his every move. The weight of the truth was undeniable. But my father, sitting at the head of the table, didn't falter. His jaw tightened, his eyes hard as stone. Enough, he said sharply. This isn't about tearing your brother down, Stella. You're being vindictive. Vindictive. That was the word he chose. Not brilliant, not loyal, not right. Vindictive. Even with the truth in black and white before his eyes, he refused to admit I had saved them all. I looked around the room, saw the shift in the board's eyes, saw Robert's shame. I knew I had won that moment. But in my father's gaze, I also knew this war wasn't over. The boardroom was still tense from the heated confrontation. Papers lay scattered across the mahogany table, and the silence felt thick enough to choke on. Stella had just exposed Robert in front of everyone, laying out the trail of negligence, the ignored warnings, the reckless gamble that nearly cost the company millions. The directors had seen the truth in her spreadsheets, the undeniable proof in her collected emails and signed reports. They had looked at Robert with narrowed eyes, whispering among themselves. For a fleeting moment, Stella thought, hoped, that this was the turning point. That maybe, just maybe, her father would finally see her not as the spare child, but as the leader she had proven herself to be. She could practically feel the tide shifting in her favor. But then David stood. His face was red, not from shame, not from the realization of his son's incompetence, but from anger at her. You have embarrassed this family enough, Stella, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. This vendetta of yours has gone far enough. Robert made a mistake, yes, but that doesn't give you the right to try to dismantle everything we've built. The words hit her like a punch. Vendetta? After all she had done, after all the nights she'd worked herself sick, saving deals Robert nearly destroyed, keeping the company afloat while her brother partied and spent freely? She tried to steady her voice. Dad, this isn't about vengeance. It's about responsibility. Robert isn't capable of running this company. The numbers, the evidence, the board can all see it. But David's eyes hardened. You've been blinded by ambition. You've always resented your brother, always wanted more than your place. This company is a family legacy, and you are tearing it apart. Her heart pounded in her ears. Always wanted more than your place. That sentence echoed. She realized then that no matter what she did, no matter how many millions she secured, no matter how much proof she put in front of him, her father would never see her as more than a tool, a worker to build the empire for Robert to inherit. Robert smirked from across the table, sensing his father's shield was still firmly in place. She's obsessed, Dad. She just can't stand that you trust me more. The board shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding Stella's eyes. The truth had been laid bare, yet David's word was final. Finally, David slammed his palm on the table. If you cannot put this family first, if you insist on waging war against your own brother, then perhaps you should reconsider your place here entirely. Step back now, or I will cut you out completely. No inheritance. No stake. Nothing. Her breath caught. She had built this empire with her blood and sleepless nights, and he would dare strip it away because she refused to keep quiet? In that moment, something inside her broke, and then hardened. For years she had chased scraps of his approval, hoping one day he would look at her with pride. Now she saw the truth. David never loved her as his daughter. He loved her as his best employee, his soldier, his builder. She was the architect of an empire meant only for Robert. The heartbreak was sharp, but behind it burned fury. She stood tall, her voice steady even as her heart splintered. If that's how you see me, then you've already lost me. David scoffed, waving her off. Don't be dramatic. But Stella wasn't bluffing. She had been preparing, piece by piece, for the moment she might have to walk away. And she would. Not just empty-handed. She would take more than they ever expected. As she gathered her papers, the room felt small, suffocating. Yet she walked out taller than she ever had before. David thought cutting her out would end her story. He had no idea. It was only the beginning. Stella walked out of the boardroom that night with her father's final words ringing in her ears. Vindictive, ungrateful, destructive. He hadn't seen her as a daughter, not really. For years she had been the one holding the company together while Robert floated in and out of luxury, always the golden son, always forgiven. David had never valued her except as a pair of hands, a sharp mind, someone to polish Robert's throne. That realization didn't just sting, it burned her down to her core. But Stella wasn't going to let it end there. If they thought they could discard her, they were wrong. She had poured her soul into that empire, and though she would leave it behind, she wouldn't walk away with empty hands. For weeks, Stella quietly mapped her escape. She knew every client, every deal, every weak spot in the fortress she herself had built. And she also knew who had stayed loyal to her. Not Robert, not David, but the clients who trusted her strategies, who listened when she spoke, who saw her brilliant. She started motto, "You think Stella made the right call by turning her back on the very legacy she built, or should she have given her father and brother one last chance?" Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. King Quiet Calls. Not promises, not bold declarations, just small seeds planted in careful conversations. If you ever feel uneasy about the direction the company is heading, know that I'll be here. If you want leadership that listens, remember my door will be open. She wasn't stealing, she was preparing. The day she resigned, she didn't slam doors or throw accusations. She simply walked into her father's office, handed over a typed letter, and said calmly, "I've given too much of my life here to be treated as less than my brother. You wanted me gone, so I'll give you exactly that." David smirked, certain she'd wither without his approval. Robert even laughed, tossing a sarcastic, "Good luck out there, sis," over his shoulder. They had no idea. Stella wasted no time. She launched her own firm, leaner, sharper, hungrier. Her reputation alone brought her first clients. But soon word spread that her strategies weren't just good, they were transformative. Deals that had once gone through David's company began shifting toward her. A few at first, then many. By the end of the first quarter, she wasn't a shadow competitor, she was a storm. Clients admired Stella because she was genuine. She didn't use them as stepping stones like Robert. She respected their vision, built with them rather than over them. Her new company had an energy her father's lacked, modern, transparent, fueled by loyalty rather than fear. Meanwhile, back at her father's empire, cracks spread fast. Robert, drunk on the illusion of power, pushed reckless deals, chasing numbers without foresight. Longtime clients complained of arrogance, mismanagement, unkept promises. David tried to steady the sinking ship, but his refusal to ever hold Robert accountable had created a monster. And monsters don't build, they devour. Within a year, Stella's firm surpassed them. Her profits soared while her father's company bled from every corner. Employees defected in waves, chasing the woman they knew had true vision. When Stella read the reports of her father's losses, she didn't smile with cruelty. No, her satisfaction came from something deeper. They hadn't fallen because of her sabotage, they had destroyed themselves. She had simply chosen to rise elsewhere. One evening, as she stood in her new office overlooking the city skyline, she finally breathed freely. The empire she built was hers, untouchable. And for the first time, Stella felt something sweeter than revenge, rebirth. The dining room glowed with warm amber light, laughter spilling from every corner of the long oak table Stella had carefully chosen for this night. Plates of food, roast lamb, buttery potatoes, fresh salads, were spread across the surface, but what filled the air more than the aroma was the energy. Stella sat at the head of the table, her position not accidental, her smile effortless. Around her were her team, her friends, the people who had believed in her when no one else had. These were not just employees. They were the architects of the empire she had built from the ashes of betrayal. It had been a year since that dinner when her father, David, had smiled and declared Robert as the heir. A year since Stella walked away, vowing never to be diminished again. In those 12 months, she had poured every ounce of her skill, her reputation, and her passion into building something of her. And now it stood towering, bigger, stronger, more respected than the company she had once grown for her father. The dinner tonight was more than a celebration of profits or expansion. It was a celebration of freedom. Every glass raised was a reminder that Stella had carved her own place in the world, one that no man could take from her. Halfway through the night, as conversations buzzed and her closest ally recounted the story of how their latest deal had crushed yet another rival, Stella's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen and froze. The name flashing there was one she hadn't seen in months. David. A hush fell in her mind, though the room remained lively. She stepped away quietly, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and answered. "Stella." His voice was hoarse, stripped of its old authority. "I know it's been a long time, but I need to ask something of." She said nothing, only letting the silence press him to continue. "The company. Robert's made a mess of it. We're drowning. The board is restless, clients are gone. If you don't step in, it will collapse completely. This is still your family's legacy. Save it." Stella let the words wash over her. Once, she would have given anything to hear her father admit he needed her. Once, she would have bent herself backwards to fix the mess. But that Stella no longer existed. She drew in a slow breath, her reflection catching in the darkened glass of the window. "That legacy was mine, Dad," she said softly but firmly. "And you gave it away. Now it's gone." For a long moment, there was nothing on the other end but a shallow exhale, the sound of a man realizing the weight of his own choices. She didn't wait for a response. Stella ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and walked toward the table where her people were waiting. As she rejoined them, someone raised a glass in her direction. "To Stella," they cheered, the one who never looked back. Her chest swelled, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She didn't need her father's validation anymore. She didn't need to inherit anything. She had built her own legacy with her own hands, surrounded by people who truly saw her worth. When the night ended, Stella stepped outside. The cool air kissed her skin, and the city skyline stretched ahead, glowing with possibility. She walked forward, free, powerful, and, at last, fully recognized. Not by David, not by Robert, but by herself. Do you think Stella made the right call by turning her back on the very legacy she built? Or should she have given her father and brother one last chance? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one.